Hi Year 10s, welcome to our next week in Year 10 Science. This is our fourth week of our trimester in biology. This week we're looking at genetics and inheritance, and this will be a 2-week topic, and probably our last one before our test. So we're going to split this into 2 weeks like I said, so let's start the first week. It's not a very long PowerPoint because you'll also be working on your she task during this week. So let's begin. First off, I suppose, what is genetics? And you've probably seen a poster of this gentleman in my classroom. This is Gregor Mendel. So genetics, study of genes. Genes are the key to inheritance. They allow living things to pass on their traits, characteristics to their descendants. It allows us to carry on the traits from our ancestors. And the fundamentals of this was discovered by Gregor Mendel in the 19th century. He discovered this experiment through looking at peas. We'll watch a video about that in class. Some examples of this include in humans, inheritable traits that we have in humans are dimples, double-jointed thumbs, and our hair colour. Now there is a video that, like I said, we'll watch in class. This is what is genetics. It's a TED talk. We'll watch it in class, or you could look it up on YouTube if you'd like to as well. Simple inheritance. So this is basically what Mendel concluded from, or came up with the idea of when he did these experiments in the 19th century. So he looked at many traits in pea plants. Specifically, the one we're talking about is going to be the colour of peas. And he determined that simple inheritance meant that one gene controlled whether a gene was expressed or not. So basically there was one gene in the pea's body that would determine whether those plants would be green or yellow. He also determined that each gene has different variations of that gene that can be used. So for example, the hair colour, we've got blonde hair, black hair, red hair, brown hair. All of these different variations of the same gene, we call those alleles. He showed that some alleles were dominant, which means they were more likely to be expressed, and an organism was more likely to show those traits if they had that gene, whereas some other genes or alleles were called recessive, which means they are less likely to be expressed or to have organisms display those properties. That leads into the talk of phenotype and genotype. So two different terms here, and we've highlighted some key parts there in red. So phenotype is the physical appearance. So we've highlighted pH there. Phenotype is the physical appearance of an organism. So we could say, I have brown hair. That is my phenotype. My genotype is the genes that I have in my body that allow me to express that phenotype. So I have brown hair somewhere because I have an allele for brown hair. Now, is brown hair dominant? Do I have a recessive red hair gene that's not being expressed? Or do I have two brown hair genes? That I can't tell just by looking at me. We need to look at my children and more than one child and see what they're looking at, or I could have a genetic testing to see what alleles I have. So basically the genotype is the genes you inherit from your parents, one from each parent, and then we're going to look at which one's dominant or recessive, and whatever's dominant in simple inheritance will be the one that you express. When we're doing this and we're writing on the board, and we'll do this in class, anything that is dominant we use a capital letter for. Anything that's recessive we use a lowercase letter. We'll generally use the same letter. So say we're talking about hair and we want to talk about brown hair or black hair, or brown hair and red hair, we might say a capital R is brown hair and a lowercase r is red hair, but we're using R for both variations. An example of this is Mendel was testing pea colour. The colours were yellow and green. Mendel's experiment showed that yellow was dominant over green, so when we're doing this we'd use the letter Y. Capital Y will represent yellow and a little y will represent green. Now there's some different terms here. So if you've got two dominant alleles here, you'd be classified as homozygous dominant, and you'd be a yellow pea because you've got two of the yellow alleles. This one down here, because it's got one capital Y and one lowercase y, it has an allele for yellow and it has an allele for green. Yellow is dominant over green, so this one in simple inheritance will mean that this has to be a yellow pea because it's got one dominant allele. Down here below, this is another homozygous. This time it's homozygous recessive because the organism only has two recessive alleles, which means the only colour that can express is green, and that has to be a green plant. So those terms I was just talking about, homozygous and heterozygous. If they have two identical alleles, we call it homozygous for that trait. Homo means same. So two capital Y's would be homozygous dominant for yellow, two lowercase y's would be homozygous recessive for the green gene. If the organism, on the other hand, had different alleles, we refer to it as heterozygous, hetero meaning different. So it has different alleles. So the capital Y, lowercase y, that's heterozygous because it has one gene for yellow and one gene for green. We're going to do a little bit of study now as well. So here's a picture that we're going to explain. So this is a portrait of a family that's been painted. This is the Fugate family. Okay. In class, you'll have a little bit of time to explain what this picture is and explain what's actually happening. And so basically what we've seen here is these people here, the dad and a few of the children, have blue tinted skin. So what's actually happening there? The Fugate family living in Kentucky in the 1800s, and they had a number of children. 4 of those children had a special condition that causes their blood to be blue, and that made their skin appear slightly blue. It's caused by a rare recessive gene. In order for their children to show that trait, because it's recessive and it's simple inheritance, both parents have to have the recessive gene, but only if you have 2 recessive genes would you actually show it. So dad, obviously, in that picture here, so dad obviously is homozygous recessive, and mum had to be heterozygous. So she still has the recessive gene, because she's got one dominant, she doesn't have blue blood. Therefore, when their children are born, there is a chance that some children will they have to receive the recessive gene from dad. So all of the children that don't have blue skin, they have to have received a recessive gene from dad. But the others, also, they must have received a recessive gene from mum, whereas those without blue blood have received the dominant gene from mum. So there's a chance that these 3 children could have children that have blue blood, whereas these ones as well, they also have a higher chance that their children will have blue blood. So, can we predict inheritance? Yes, we can, and that's through Punnett squares, which we'll do in class. So basically, when 2 organisms produce offspring, the offspring gets a combination of genes from each parent. Based on the genotype of the parents, we can predict the chances an offspring will show certain characteristics if they're using simple inheritance, and we use Punnett squares to determine this. And again, there's a video that we'll watch in class, and we'll also do these on the board and a number of worksheets. Smaller PowerPoint this week because you're working on the sheet task. See you in class.